To kick this off, I want to give a little bit of background on MedRhythms as a company. We are working to develop next generation digital therapeutics with prescription music. As we mentioned in our introduction, we're using sensors, music, and software to build evidence-based neurologic interventions to measure and improve walking. If you take a look at the diagram on the right-hand side and start at the bottom left, you'll see in a circle a set of headphones. Basically, the user is getting a playlist of music through that headset, and in a closed loop system, that patient starts walking, listening to the music. There are sensors connected to both the left and the right shoe. Those sensors are collecting clinical grade biomechanics. About 40 gait parameters are collected on each sensor, the one on the left and the one on the right. Those sensors feed that data back through algorithms into an app that's housed on a mobile device. The algorithm is designed to build individualized, challenging, and progressive interventions. So to create a customized intervention, the algorithm is dealing with real-time information on how the user is functioning at that particular moment. It is then adding challenge into that by increasing difficulty during the intervention to facilitate functional improvement. And it's progressive in that that intervention can drive the user within and across sessions toward their clinical goals. This product has received breakthrough device designation from the FDA to treat chronic stroke walking deficits. We're currently in a randomized controlled trial at some of the nation's top rehab hospitals and research centers, looking at walking deficits after chronic stroke. We also have an active pipeline where we're looking at other neurologic conditions and using these prescriptional digital therapeutics to look at multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, and several other clinical programs. We are dedicated to developing therapeutics with a biologic mechanism of action and pharma-like outcomes. The mechanism of action we're targeting is auditory motor entrainment. Auditory motor entrainment occurs when an external rhythmic cue activates the auditory system. And as a result of subconscious connections between our auditory motor systems through the reticulospinal tract, we can engage the motor system at the same time. So the auditory and motor systems are firing synchronously with each other to that external rhythmic cue. This mechanism of action underpins the science behind rhythmic auditory stimulation, or RAS, which has been shown to improve walking outcomes in people with neurologic injuries and diseases. RAS uses music to improve functional outcomes, and specifically, I'm referring to such outcomes as gait speed, symmetry, stride length, balance, and fall risk. These outcomes have been demonstrated across diagnoses, including stroke, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, aging, and cerebral palsy. Our intervention is seeking to digitize RAS. Music produces global activation in the brain, meaning that there's diffuse activation of multiple brain regions when exposed to music. That's unlike any other stimulus in the world. So our platform is built to be used autonomously in home and utilizes user-preferred music to enhance outcomes and engagement. Research has shown that user-preferred music can lead to better outcomes. If you're interested in what you're listening to and it's your favorite type of music, you're going to be motivated to move with it. So to provide this to patients, we've actually been able to partner with Universal Music Group in the last couple of months, and they're the world's largest record label. So this is really exciting news that we're actually going to be able to provide playlists and a library across very diverse tastes, so that anyone who's interested or has particular individual music tastes are going to be able to have a playlist that would be interesting to them to listen to. So that's our platform in a nutshell. Our clinical trial pipeline spans the gamut from more traditional study designs with on-site study visits, in-person consent visits, and then we have other trials designed to be a little bit more decentralized. Some of our studies use a hybrid model where participants come for the first and the last study visits, meet the study team, maybe do the consent in person, and then they're able to take the device home with them and perform the other study visits on their own at home. This decreases the number of times they have to travel to an institution that's participating in one of these trials. In other studies, we've been able to set up online patient identification and recruitment, eConsent practices, remote monitoring, and other decentralized trial methods for our DTX pipelines. So next, we're going to dive into some of the pros and cons of DTX and decentralized trials. But first, I'd like to take a quick poll of the audience. I see there's a large number, and I'd love to hear how you view the biggest challenges for DTX clinical trials. So with that, I'm going to ask the XTalks team to pull up our poll question.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So audience members, you should be seeing that poll question on your screens now. And that question is, what do you see as the biggest challenge for DTX clinical trials? And your options are difficulty defining controls and placebos, or that could be ill-defined endpoints, or privacy and information security, or that could be continuity, changing regulatory environment, or varied and dynamic participant interactions. So once again, audience members, that question is, what do you see as the biggest challenge for DTX clinical trials? So the results are as follows. 16% of you voted for difficulty defining controls and placebos. 11% of audience members voted for ill-defined endpoints. 16% again voted for privacy and information security. 11% voted for continually changing regulatory environment. And then 47% of audience members voted for varied and dynamic participant interactions. So again, thank you everyone for voting, and back to our speakers.
Thank you, Samaya. That was great. Very interesting dynamic between all of those. I completely agree that the patient interaction is definitely got to be the hardest part, but also the most important part to focus on. But I was also interested to see that pretty much all the other options came out about equal, meaning that there are just a lot of general challenges to DTX clinical trials, and everyone recognizes that there's different levels and there are different ways to look at this. And not all challenges are equal, but that certain ones of them might be more important, and that is the patient experience. So with that, I'm going to turn over to comparing some attributes between medical interventions, wellness apps, and specifically DTX. So in comparison to wellness apps, DTX is seeking to improve an individual's health and deliver an engaging experience. But it goes beyond that to physically treat a disease or injury, and can often complement or extend the benefits of currently approved biomedical interventions. If you keep this example in mind, for the wellness app, you might create a playlist with music designed to support meditation practices. With a DTX product that's utilizing music as a prescription in a clinical trial for the treatment of an injury, you're looking for a particular indication, you're making a claim, and you have to get an approval for that claim. So there should be a very different process to how those get approved and what you can say they're doing to actually treat someone for whatever it is they're looking at. And we're looking specifically at neurologics in our interests. So in many respects, digital therapeutics are more closely akin to a pharmacological or medical device intervention than wellness apps, as you can see from the figure in our slide 11 here on the screen. Some DTX products are focused on using a biological mechanism of action, like ours using auditory motor entrainment to treat an injury or illness and produce pharma-like outcomes. One important distinction between DTX and medications or medical devices is that you can design and test a DTX product faster than a pharmaceutical or traditional medical device. However, the DTX products are still subject to traditional regulatory oversight compared to wellness apps. This can boost trust in the device and increase the value to patients, families, providers, because the rigorous oversight provides confidence that this is an effective and safe treatment for that approved indication. Clinical trials for DTX are exciting because they present a whole new world of data capture and analysis opportunities. The flow of real-time data helps pinpoint how well patients adhere to the therapy and the actual effect of the treatment on their behavior. However, the fluidity of these trials also makes establishing and proving endpoints more complicated than traditional trials. Creating traditional endpoints, proper randomization, and ensuring patient engagement all present significant challenges for DTX clinical trials. Now that we understand some of these attributes of DTX, let's talk a little bit more about some of the benefits to running clinical trials with DTX products. Completely decentralized clinical trials is a relatively new concept. Research has certainly dabbled in decentralization techniques and tools for a while, and clinical telehealth has been around for quite some time. However, COVID has certainly accelerated the process to deploy more decentralized trials. But why is that? What makes them so important and so helpful? One could argue that adherence to protocols with traditional treatments can be low. It really depends on the population you're focusing on, the study design, how complicated your protocol is, and several other variables. However, without doubt, DTX can increase patient engagement and lead to better outcomes. So the data-driven treatments can support quicker changes and decision-making. Also, DTX are high-quality treatments. They're not assistive devices. They're therapeutics, and in many ways, are employing a biologic mechanism of action and demonstrating pharma-like outcomes. So we're really optimizing our clinical and health economic outcomes. DTX can meet the patients where they are. They can reduce access barriers by delivering therapies to underserved populations and provide at-home solutions. We can diminish transportation barriers. One study has found that many participants in any clinical trial are 2 or more hours away from the institutions in which they're participating in those trials. How does the patient get there? Are they relying on a caregiver? Do they need public transportation? Can they drive themselves? Are they parking in a big city? All of these things become less important if they're actually able to do the therapy at home. We can make DTX available to people who want the privacy of using the device at home. Perhaps they live in more rural areas. Maybe they're not community ambulators at this point. I was talking to a colleague just before this talk, and we've had several people participate in some of our studies and have found that they're always grateful that this is being held as an opportunity for them, that we can send them the device and they could use it from home. It's allowing them to engage meaningfully in their health. They want to be involved and haven't maybe been able to do that in the past. Again, we're reducing caregiver burden and we're making treatments more accessible to people who might not have a caregiver. In addition, we can get DTX products to people more efficiently, which might circumvent supply chains or restrictions around location. I don't know if anyone's been trying to get plastic for their labs for whatever test tubes that they might need. Things are hard now to sometimes get these pretty normal and mundane materials for the lab. And so being able to have these things in-house that we can get to our patients directly really helps speed things along. DTX can transform how patients engage in their healthcare. They are there in the driver's seat now. More and more DTX products and systems are autonomous as well as user-friendly. The emphasis is now on a patient-centered design. DTX is also helpful with regard to scalability. For us, again, at MedRhythms, there are 3.5 million stroke survivors in the US who are at increased risk of falls and reduced quality of life. That's an enormous number that there's no one answer to try to help them all. And so being able to have a scalable technology such as a DTX product like this to send out and get to them and have them be able to use that at home is paramount. We can also, using DTX, strengthen the care continuum. We can fill or extend gaps in the care continuum. MedRhythms is actually providing patients and clinicians with a solution where there currently is no standard of care in the chronic stroke population. We can also support healthcare teams in diverse settings with varying degrees of infrastructure. Maybe we have inpatient and outpatient settings. Maybe we are in SNFs and LTACs, rehab facilities at home, anything like that. If we can work with a diverse team who might be able to bring these DTX products to their patients, that would increase the available infrastructure to all of those different groups. And last, but certainly not least, we're talking about lowering costs pretty much across the board. We can make care more affordable for patients and caregivers. We can reduce the cost to the healthcare system. I saw an article, a manuscript published by Purser in 2005, where each 0.1 meter per second increase in walking speed results in improved health status and physical function, fewer basic and instrumental disabilities, fewer hospitalization days, and a 1-year cost reduction of more than $1,000. So this would lower costs for the healthcare system, for actually initiating and running these trials, getting answers faster, and then lower costs for our patients and caregivers. So there's lots of good reasons to support DTX in medicine. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Kim.
Sabrina, thank you so much. And I just want to say, I think it's absolutely fascinating, the work that you are doing at MedRhythms. And it's amazing to think that music can have such an impact from a neurological perspective that it can actually create changes within the body. So kudos to the team at MedRhythms. I want to talk a little bit today about the continuum as we talk about clinical research. So if we move to the next slide. Most of us that have historically been in the pharmaceutical industry for some time are very familiar with what I would like to call the traditional approach to clinical research, which means that all of the patient visits have to be conducted at a physical site. And there have historically been some challenges and barriers when we talk about things like inclusion and diversity. If a site is located far away, so let's say we have patients that are in need of participating in clinical research and are interested in experimental medicines or therapies, but they have to drive 3 hours to get to a physical site location, that can be extraordinarily rate limiting. So the beauty of kind of decentralized methods is this idea that trial procedures can be conducted virtually, and they can be enabled by technology, and also improved supply delivery right to a person's home. And what we've also seen is this idea around a hybrid concept. So that really provides for flexibility and choice. And if I reflect on the poll question that we asked and the answer that all of you gave, it really was this idea of patients have different preferences, and we seek to really enable that as we move forward. So some patients may actually, in fact, want to go into a site and see a doctor. Other patients may say, a remote visit is absolutely fantastic. I was at a conference this morning, and the woman who heads up the sickle cell kind of research alliance was talking about the fact that during COVID, being able to do her visits from home was a blessing. She was very concerned about going into a physical site or doctor's office, just because at that point, she's feeling like she's immunocompromised, and that is not something that she really wanted to do or risk that she wanted to take. So her study was enabled through these decentralized methods that we're talking about today. So when we're talking about the ideas and the concepts around decentralized trials, we're really talking about the ease with which you are able to find out about a clinical trial, and you are able to then pre-screen and see if you meet the actual criteria to enroll in that trial. You are then able to enroll and consent all via, being at home. And in our case, we enable, from a caster perspective, both the at-home process, but we also do enable the site process. So for those patients that do prefer to go into the site or the doctor's office, they're able to do that as well. And from a technology perspective, it's great to essentially enable that flexibility, choice, optionality. And again, that's a huge contrast from historical methods of requiring that every single patient has to come into the site, which can be onerous, as we just talked about. And then when we think about kind of the eSource, EDC, CDMS, at the end of the day, what we're really talking about is data capture and how we capture data. And of course, from a regulatory perspective, we need to enable and facilitate data capture. It needs to be captured in a standardized way. There needs to be audit trail abilities to know exactly where that data came from, if any transformations have been performed on that data. All of that needs to be clearly understood. And so again, we enable and empower that from a decentralized perspective. And I would say, as we think about the future of clinical research, what we are seeing, anticipating, and building for is this idea of being able to connect in multiple different sources of data. And again, this is historically been challenging for some sponsors because the original kind of genesis of EDC was automating or digitizing what we call the case report form. And the case report form would outline everything that needed to be captured about that specific patient, specific to the protocol. It did require, and still does in many cases, dual data entry between what is captured in the electronic data capture system, in addition to sometimes the same data being captured in the electronic health record. And there, again, hasn't historically been a great deal of flexibility in terms of pulling in real world data sources, such as your Fitbit data. I like to say Fitbit, Apple, Garmin, take your pick, data that may or may not be relevant for your specific study. And or it's really interesting, people have access to all sorts of data these days. I know for me, I've done the 23andMe genomic data collection. And so I also have access to that information. And again, it's not necessarily that a sponsor would decide to incorporate all of those elements or bits, but the point is that there should be the option to bring in those pieces as appropriate and collect all of that data in one repository, which then facilitates, again, acceleration with regulatory approval, as well as the option to do further analysis on that data, as long as it's been consented to. And then we have the concept of what does the patient themselves, what kind of experience do they want to have? And so I like to argue all the time that I no longer go to grocery stores. I personally hate them. And so I'm very happy that I have Instacart, which allows me to click, 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 and have my groceries delivered to my home. And so we are trying to facilitate a much more sophisticated experience for patients where they can use their mobile app or their iPad, and they can fill out their surveys from a patient-reported outcomes perspective. And we envision a future whereby we enable kind of two-way communication, and we're getting continuous input from the patients, as well as providing a high value exchange with the patients relative to their data. As you heard Sabrina say earlier, patients actually are very interested in the data. Believe it or not, they really are. It's their data, it's their body, it's their healthcare journey, and they want to have the optionality again to understand that data and to share that data in many cases with their primary care physician. So those are things that we at Castor are thinking about and spending our time on building out and making that patient experience as positive as possible as it relates to clinical research. And then from an API integrations perspective, I think, again, that's getting fairly technical, but it just has to do with the methods that we use to collect all of those real world data sources into one kind of aggregated repository. So I think from a decentralized clinical trial perspective, specific to digital therapeutics, I always say I believe and I feel that it's the perfect marriage. So in many respects, our partners that we have, including MedRhythms, from a digital therapeutics perspective, they operate and think actually very much like we do at Castor, and it's the idea of what is going to serve the patients best. And then allowing for kind of a light touch, but high value and high impact. So again, you can see that you can use decentralized clinical trial methods for recruitment. You can use it for eConsent. You can go direct to patient. I think in phase 1, you usually have healthy volunteers that are at the clinical research units themselves. So that may not be as applicable. However, you could use decentralized methods for longitudinal kind of follow-up type studies. And then in addition, obviously, we already touched on patient-reported outcomes, clinical outcome assessments, and decentralized methods lend themselves well in that space. Televisits are key because, again, if you're going to enable individuals to have discussions with their healthcare providers at home, it is very useful to, again, empower kind of that televisit and allow for, in many respects, that face-to-face discussion. And we've seen that to be especially useful in the consenting space because, again, we talk a lot in this industry about making consent easier to understand. And at the same time, we recognize and value the healthcare provider's role in providing clarity around that consenting document and what the patient is actually consenting to. So with our solution, we facilitate that face-to-face interaction via the televisit. And then obviously decentralized clinical trials include things like home nursing. And so you can have a nurse that's actually deployed to your home, connected devices, and that runs the gamut, everything from EKGs to being able to blow into a tube and understand what's happening from a respiratory perspective. And then also just overall, I think we need to get more and more focused on remote support overall, and decentralized clinical trials do that. So at Castor, one of the things we're most proud of is the work that we did with the World Health Organization. And this was really the COVID red study that we did. We also partnered with Takeda and Julius Clinical. And essentially what we saw is a huge acceleration in our patient recruitment timelines using our platform, essentially, and using devices. So we had 17,824 participants that were enrolled in 15 weeks. And truly, that kind of recruitment would take, on average, I would say the norm would be probably something like 2 years. So the acceleration that we were able to achieve leveraging our platform was very significant. And I always say, COVID did help, push us a little bit further into this space. But I also like to remind people that, whether you're ready for a study of this magnitude from a decentralized clinical trial perspective, or you really just want to even dip your toe in the water and start with things like eConsent, I think that is a fully appropriate approach. And these methods are new to a lot of sponsors. And so just starting somewhere and dipping your toe in the water can be very useful to get comfortable that these approaches actually do work and are effective, and they can have a significant impact on cost and timelines in terms of getting to regulatory approval. So overall, I think decentralized clinical trials, again, allow and facilitate that integrated patient experience with a heavy emphasis on also collecting data in a standardized way. And we think a lot about data interoperability and being able to use it across the ecosystem as well. So again, with the integrated patient experience, it's this idea that you improve accessibility and, I would argue, inclusion and diversity by allowing a larger patient population to even have an awareness of these types of studies that are available to them, experimental medicines and therapies that are available to them, and then having them have an amazing experience as they go through that process. So essentially, in summary, we did promise through through this webinar that we would talk through and share, kind of from Sabrina and I's perspective, some of the challenges that we are aware of that you face as you go through kind of working to implement decentralized clinical trial methods and possible solutions. So I'm going to walk through these really quickly, and then I think what we'd like to do is open it up for discussion and any questions that you as the audience might have. So I think you noticed in the poll, we talked a little bit about the difficulty in defining controls and placebos. And one of the things that needs to be done really to mitigate that challenge is having early discussions, partnering with regulatory bodies. I would like to argue partnering, if there's an opportunity to partner with regulatory bodies, and asking them what is acceptable as far as control or placebo for a specific study. And that's going to be different depending on the therapeutic area that you are talking about. In terms of ill-defined endpoints, again, I think that the endpoint discussion must start at the point of study design. And so these have to be kind of built into the study right up front and have to be acknowledged that they are accessible to collect at home and that they are patient-centered, essentially facilitating, again, I would argue ease of being able for the participant to either provide that data and or to ideally even passively collect the data that would help inform those primary endpoints that have been defined in the protocol. There's also the challenge around security. I would say any decentralized clinical trial vendor, and Castor is no exception, is extraordinarily focused on security and data privacy. And in fact, we do our own internal, kind of hacking and making sure that we are kind of have a fortress around our data. And I think that's true for any decentralized clinical trial partner, but it is something to consider and take into account. In terms of gaining regulatory approval, again, we've actually seen a lot of success in this space. So kudos to the industry, kudos to the trailblazers in the digital therapeutic space, because they are going after it and they are having appropriate discussions, and they are also appropriately showing the safety and efficacy of these new therapies. And so we are seeing that they are being approved, which is great and very encouraging. I think another challenge just to acknowledge is, we mentioned a little bit the central data collection. Again, I would argue the decentralized methods actually improves that greatly. And in fact, you can use methods such as digital marketing that are very targeted to find specific participants. And if you do that successfully, and you have a website where individuals kind of land, if they have an interest, so they're Googling on asthma, and you happen to have a trial in the asthma space, and they click on a link and they're sent to this website, they should be able to very quickly understand whether they meet the criteria. And again, it can be at a high level, but it's helpful to quickly either qualify or disqualify participants. And the idea, once again, is to have patients participate in clinical research with a diverse background that allows us to understand whether the therapies that we're deploying are applicable across the board. And so I would just argue that decentralized methods allow you to do that much more so in some cases than traditional methods or models. And then we talked a little bit about you as an audience saw that the varied and dynamic participant interactions can be challenging. And so again, we would just argue that you do need to have a centralized platform and the ability to view, real-time data and make informed decisions during the trial's execution.
Now, please join us in thanking today's speakers for that fantastic presentation, Kimberly Tableman and Sabrina Taylor. We hope you found this webinar informative. Have a great day, everyone.